All right, physiological psychology students, it's time to get into the lectures. This is going to be the first of the physiological basics. This is going to take some time, but we'll record kind of unit by unit here. So we're going to start with chapter 1 from the book. And if you have the outline, the agenda, you can start with me. The first question I wanted to explore was kind of the philosophical question of mind and body. You're probably familiar with this question if you've taken some classes in psychology. The question of, is the mind separate or is it the same thing as the body? Are they related at all? Are mind, mental things, and emotional states the same as physiological states? And so the question of the separation, or are they similar, mind and body, has a lot to do with this class. The first person who really did some research on this, or actually came up with an informed position, was René Descartes, page 9 of your book. He came up with the position of actually dualism. He said the mind and body are separate. The mind is something that is left to spiritualists, psychologists, religious people, and the body is completely separate from the mind, and that's really the purview, if you will, of doctors and people in medicine. So he said the mind and body are completely separate, and that's even why to this day we have psychology people working on mental states, and at the same time we have doctors working on the physiological state. So Descartes had the position of dualism. You can add a little more information from the book as far as that is concerned, because the book has a lot more to say in regards to this. Another very important person, though, well, not an important person, but another position on this, is that the mind and body are not separate. And a lot of people now really do believe that the mind and body are not separate, that they're actually similar in a way. And so there's the position of monism. And there are two different types of positions I wanted to share with you in terms of monism. One position basically suggests that there is a link between mind and body, but the link between them, according to some, is not a direct link. You just can't take any mental state and reduce it to, let's say, a neuron. That it's not a perfect match, that there's no perfect match between what's going on mentally and what's going on physiologically. That there are commonalities among the two, but it's not a perfect match. So if you take the position of token reductionism, reductionism is the belief that mental states can reduce themselves into physiological states. If you believe in token reductionism, you basically believe that, you could actually take something like depression, and for a lot of people with depression, there would be some commonality with serotonin and neurons, but it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one match. So token reductionism says there is a link, and you can reduce some, but it's not a perfect one-to-one match. On the other hand, type reductionism is the position that, yes, you could actually take any specific mental state and reduce it to the level of maybe a neuron. And a good example of this is the discovery quite a few years ago now of what they called grandmother cells. Let me explain this story to you with grandmother cells. Researchers doing research with monkeys. They basically found that there were cells in the monkey's brain that would correspond that when a monkey looked at a familiar face, there would be a different neuron that would go off every time the monkey looked at a different face. And so it's as if there were specific little neurons that mapped right to different faces. So if you take perception of faces as a mental state, and then you have one neuron doing that, that's a perfect mind-body link and type reductionism. So it was the idea of they actually called these neurons that were used to recognize faces, they called them grandmother cells. So do we have cells in our brain that are just based on remembering the names of people who have different faces, the different people in our lives? So they were called grandmother cells, or one-to-one reductionism. So philosophically, we believe in this particular class that there is a link between mind and body. We're going to study the link between emotions and behavior. The book also talks about the famous case of a guy named Phineas Gage, who it was found was a mild-mannered person working on the railroad, and then one day there was an explosion and a rod went right through his brain, and all of a sudden that physiological change turned out it changed his personality, so that there's a link between personality and mental states and one's physiology. So we'll take that particular position. Next on the hit parade is the position of phrenology. It was one of the first ideas of mapping mind to body. People in phrenology, and I believe this is somewhere in your book, believe that there was a link between mind and body, and you could look at different portions of the brain and basically how large different areas were on the brain would correspond to your mental functioning. So that was the first attempt to kind of link mind and body, that if you had a larger portion of this size of your brain on the outside, that would say you're more intelligent, you're more emotional, and so forth. So that was the study of phrenology. Okay, back to our story here. Sorry, I just had a little pause in the tape here. I was looking at the wrong book while I was going through here. Your book actually on page 7 does have the phrenology movement on this idea of mind to body, and also has the situation of Phineas Gage. It's better if I do that with you. Next is the idea of the neuron. We didn't know that there were little gaps between neurons in our brain. The discovery that there are neurons and that there are little gaps actually was very important in physiological psychology, because then you could study the chemicals up in the brain. So page 11, it talks about the neuron and the fact that there's a little gap between the two with all these different chemicals. Next is basically some of the ways that we do studies in neuroscience. If you start on page 14, I remember when I was doing animal neuroscience, one of the main apparatus was something called the stereotaxic instrument, which is shown on page 14. You would actually, I would work with animals, and you could put, after you anesthetized the animal, you could put an electrode into certain parts of their brain. You'd know where the key structures are, and then you could deliver chemicals or electricity and test what different areas of the brain actually do. So this is called a stereotaxic apparatus. They use that for animals. For human research, we do things, well, we've got a couple of different techniques available to us. You can do an EEG, where you hook up the brain. It's a non-invasive procedure. My daughter, who has epilepsy, you basically hook up the brain. You can see the picture on 16, and you can record action potentials from the brain and actually see if the electricity is working right. Somebody with epilepsy, that's many times that is not working correct. CAT scan is where you take kind of a static image of the brain. PET scan gives you more details, and then you have something else that the book mentions called a functional MRI, where you can actually see how much glucose the brain is using with a PET scan or an MRI across time. So we use all these techniques. You can certainly read about it in your book and kind of provide a little summary of that. Finally, there's of course the question of ethics when doing research, especially with animals. If you look on page 20, you can see some of the things that can be done to the animal. We always try to make sure people trained in this field of neuroscience know how to do these techniques with animals in ethical ways, and that they're trained and that they don't cause the animals too much pain. So I think that's the big end of the shtick. At 25, it talks about ethics. If you are going to do any animal research, you have to go through a group called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, which has to approve any research that you do and make sure that you're doing ethical things. So that'll conclude lecture number 1 on chapter number 1. Thank you. Bye-bye.